Hold on. Judge Warren Holt's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. He wasn't looking at the evidence. He wasn't looking at the bench. He was looking at Darius Cole, 26 years old, ill-fitting suit, standing alone at the plaintiff's table and smiling the way men smile when they already know the outcome. Holt reached across the bench, picked up Darius's 12-page motion, and tore it in half without breaking eye contact. Then he dropped the pieces over the edge. They drifted to the floor like they weighed nothing. "Let me ask you something," Holt said loud enough for every reporter in the room to hear. "What exactly makes a young black boy from the East Side think he belongs in my courtroom, let alone thinks he can win here?" He leaned back, folded his hands. "I've seen your kind come through that door before, son. Big eyes, borrowed suit, somebody else's briefcase." He glanced at the defense table with a thin smile. "They don't last past lunch." Glenn Stafford, seated at the defense table, didn't even try to hide it. He laughed short, sharp, like Holt had just told a joke at a private club, and Darius was the punchline. Then Stafford leaned toward his associate and said just loud enough to carry, "They let anyone in here these days, don't they?" More laughter. Quiet. Comfortable. The kind that assumes no one will object. Holt raised his gavel, still smiling. "Tell you what, son. You win this case, I'll resign from this bench myself." The gallery went still. Darius didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't look down. What Holt didn't know, what no one in Courtroom 4 understood yet, was that the motion he had just torn apart was not Darius Cole's most dangerous weapon. The most dangerous thing Darius carried into that room was what he already knew. Stay with this story. What unfolds in the next few minutes will leave you breathless. Drop your city and local time in the comments right now. People across the world are watching this together. And if you believe silence is never justice, subscribe. You don't want to miss what comes next. The call came at 5:47 in the morning. Darius was still asleep when his phone lit up the dark ceiling of his studio apartment on Gratiot Avenue. He reached for it without thinking, the way people do when they haven't yet remembered what day it is or what it might cost them. It was Patricia Hale, office manager at Brennan & Associates, the mid-sized civil rights firm where Darius had worked for 14 months as the most junior attorney on staff. Her voice was tight-clipped, the kind of voice people use when they are delivering news they did not ask to carry. "Darius, it's about Robert Finch. He had a stroke last night. He's stable, but he won't be in today." Darius sat up slowly. Robert Finch was the lead attorney on the Marcus Reed case. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock. "What about the filing?" Darius asked. "It's yours," Patricia said. "Everything transfers to you as of right now. I'm emailing the full case file in the next 10 minutes. She hung up before he could respond. Darius sat on the edge of his bed in the gray morning light and stared at the floor for exactly 30 seconds. Then he stood up, walked to his desk, and opened his laptop. He had 3 hours and 13 minutes. Marcus Reed had been convicted 21 years ago for the murder of a warehouse supervisor named Dale Pruitt in Eastside, Detroit. Marcus was 23 at the time, a soft-spoken auto worker with a spotless record, 2 younger sisters, and a daughter named Aaliyah, who was 3 years old the last time she walked out of a visiting room holding her father's hand. The prosecution's case had rested on a single eyewitness identification, made under pressure, a timeline with 3 unexplained gaps, and the confident, unhesitating testimony of Assistant District Attorney Warren Holt, who told the jury that Marcus Reed was unambiguously, undeniably guilty. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Marcus Reed had been inside the walls of Muskegon Correctional ever since. What nobody outside the original prosecution team knew, what had been buried so thoroughly it had survived 2 appeals and a federal review, was that 3 days before the trial began, a woman named Gloria Sims had walked into the precinct and told Detective Earl Grady she had seen someone else running from the warehouse that night. She described him clearly. She gave a physical description, a direction of flight, and a partial license plate. Her statement was logged. Then it disappeared. Darius had found it 6 weeks earlier by accident. He had been assigned to assist Robert Finch with document review routine archival work, the kind of task given to junior attorneys to keep them busy while the senior partners handled the parts that mattered. He was working through a misfiled box of original prosecution materials when he found a single sheet tucked beneath an unrelated motion from a 2003 parking dispute. Gloria Sims, eyewitness statement, dated 3 days before trial. He had read it twice standing at the filing cabinet, then carried it to Finch's office and set it on his desk without saying a word. Finch had stared at it for a long time. "How did you find this wrong box?" Darius said. Finch had looked at him with something that might have been relief. Good wrong box. That single document was the foundation of the emergency motion Darius had spent the last 3 weeks building into a 12-page argument for Marcus Reed's exoneration. The same 12 pages Judge Warren Holt had torn in half 40 minutes ago. Darius's mother, Yvonne Cole, had worked double shifts in the laundry room of Detroit Receiving Hospital for 19 years. She ironed other people's gowns and pressed other people's sheets so her son could sit in a library after school instead of a street corner. She never once complained about it in front of him. She never once suggested it was a sacrifice. She simply told him every single morning before he left the apartment, "You go further than this street allows you to see." His older brother, Andre, had been arrested when Darius was 10. A neighbor's car had been broken into on a Tuesday night. Andre was the only young black man walking on that block at 11 p.m., which was, in the arresting officer's words, sufficient grounds for reasonable suspicion. Andre spent 14 months in county jail before the charges were quietly dismissed. He came home thinner, quieter, and permanently careful about where he walked after dark. Darius had never forgotten the way his mother looked the night Andre was taken. Not crying, not screaming. Just standing in the doorway, with her hands folded, watching the police car disappear around the corner, wearing the expression of a woman who had always known this moment was possible and had never found a way to prepare for it anyway. That expression was why Darius Cole had gone to law school. That expression was why he was standing in Courtroom 4 right now. When Holt tore the motion apart and issued his public humiliation, Darius had felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the same pressure he had felt at 10 years old watching that police car round the corner. He let it sit there. He didn't push it down. He had learned a long time ago that the feeling wasn't weakness. It was information. He reached into his briefcase and removed a second document. A copy he had printed at 6:15 that morning because Robert Finch, despite everything, had taught him one unbreakable rule: always carry a second copy of anything that frightens the other side. He placed it on the evidence table quietly, without announcement. Holt's eyes dropped to it immediately, and for just 1 second, one brief, unguarded second, the confidence drained from Warren Holt's face like water through cracked concrete. He recovered quickly. But Darius had seen it. That flash of fear told him everything he needed to know. The question that settled in his mind as he stood in that courtroom, surrounded by laughter and contempt, was not whether he could win. It was why a federal judge was afraid of a document he claimed was worthless. Calvin Webb was leaning against the wall outside Courtroom 4 when Darius pushed through the doors during recess. He was 68 years old, broad-shouldered with close-cut white hair, and the kind of stillness that only comes from spending decades in rooms where every word carries a price. He had been a civil rights attorney for 31 years before his knees gave out and his wife made him retire to a consulting role. He had known Robert Finch for 20 years. When Finch went down the night before, Calvin Webb had driven to the courthouse at 8 in the morning, for the same reason a surgeon shows up to watch a difficult operation, not to intervene, but because some things are too important to miss. He looked at Darius without greeting him and said, "He's scared of you." Darius stopped walking. "He just had me laughed out of my own argument. Powerful men don't humiliate people they think are beneath them," Calvin said simply. "They ignore them. The only time a man like Holt performs like that is when he's trying to make the room see something other than what's actually happening." Darius studied him. "You know something about this case." Calvin pushed off the wall. "Come with me." They worked through the night in Calvin's office on East Jefferson, a narrow room stacked floor to ceiling with archived case files smelling of coffee and old paper. Calvin had pulled the original prosecution archive from a contact at the state records office 3 days earlier, the moment Finch told him about the case. He hadn't known exactly why he felt the urgency. He knew now. They went page by page through the original trial materials. Witness statements, police reports, internal memos, prosecution filings. At 1:17 in the morning, Darius found it. A suppression order. Dated 6 days before Marcus Reed's trial. Signed at the bottom in firm deliberate ink, Assistant District Attorney Warren Holt. Darius set the page on the desk between them. Neither man spoke. The order excluded Gloria Sims's eyewitness statement from trial on the stated grounds that her account was internally inconsistent and without corroborating physical evidence. It was a standard legal instrument, routine-looking, the kind of document that disappeared easily into the mass of pretrial paperwork. Except the statement it suppressed directly identified an alternate suspect, and the man who had suppressed it was now sitting on the bench in judgment of the case he had helped build. Calvin exhaled slowly through his nose. He wasn't just in the room. He was the architect. Darius looked at the signature. He's presiding over a hearing into his own conviction. Which means every ruling he's made, Calvin said, every objection he's sustained, every time he's shut you down, has been self-preservation. Darius sat back. The shape of it was becoming clear now. Not just a biased judge. A man in active concealment using the authority of the bench as a shield. He called Calvin just before 2 in the morning after returning home. "I found everything," he said. Calvin's response was quiet and immediate. "Then tomorrow we put it in front of the room." Darius arrived at Courtroom 4 the next morning, carrying a certified copy of the suppression order. The room was fuller than the day before. Word had spread the young attorney who had been publicly humiliated was returning. Some people came to watch him fail again. Others came because something in the previous day's proceedings had unsettled them in a way they couldn't yet name. Darius approached the evidence table. He placed the suppression order down, carefully, announced its submission for the record, and stated clearly, "Plaintiff moves to enter a suppression order signed by then Assistant District Attorney Warren Holt, 6 days prior to Marcus Reed's original trial, an order excluding testimony that identified an alternate suspect by physical description." The room went still. Holt's expression did not change immediately. It shifted slowly like weather moving in from the edge of a horizon. His eyes dropped to the document on the table and stayed there 1 second longer than they should have. Then he straightened. "That document is not properly before this court. Motion denied." "Your Honor," Darius said, "the document bears the presiding judge's own signature from his tenure as lead assistant prosecutor on the underlying case. Plaintiff respectfully submits this constitutes direct conflict of interest, requiring immediate recusal." Holt's jaw tightened. "I said, motion denied, Mr. Cole. Sit down." Darius did not sit. The gallery noticed. The reporters noticed. Glenn Stafford noticed, and for the first time since the proceedings began, his expression lost its comfortable ease. "Mr. Cole." Holt's voice dropped to a register that had silenced courtrooms for 20 years. "I will not repeat myself, and I will not remove evidence of judicial conflict from the record, Your Honor." The room stopped breathing. What happened next took 11 seconds. Holt raised his eyes from Darius to the 2 court security officers stationed at the side door. He pointed a single deliberate gesture and said in a voice stripped of all pretense, "Remove him. He's wasting this court's time." Both officers moved. They crossed the courtroom floor in full view of the gallery of the reporters with their recording devices of every attorney seated in that room who understood exactly what they were witnessing. They reached Darius at the plaintiff's table, took him by both arms, and walked him toward the exit. Darius did not resist. He kept his eyes forward, his spine straight, and his hands loose at his sides. As the doors swung open, he heard Stafford say something to his associate, low, satisfied, the closing line of a joke. And he heard the laughter that followed. But he also heard something else. Beneath the laughter, threading through the gallery, like a current, the sound of people who were no longer comfortable. People who had come to watch a young man fail, and were now watching something they hadn't anticipated and couldn't easily dismiss. The sound of a room that was beginning to understand. By the 4th hour of proceedings the following morning, Darius had been overruled 19 times. He had counted, not obsessively, practically. Because each ruling was a data point, and the pattern those data points formed was no longer ambiguous. Holt wasn't applying judicial discretion. He was executing a strategy. Every time Darius moved toward prosecutorial misconduct, toward the suppression order, toward the question of who had buried Gloria Sims's testimony and why, Holt shut him down before the sentence was complete. Objection relevance. Sustained. Objection foundation. Sustained. Objection argumentative. Sustained. Stafford had stopped pretending to argue the merits. He simply rose, stated the objection, and sat back down with the unhurried confidence of a man playing a game he could not lose. By the lunch recess, Darius had presented less than a third of his intended argument. Diane Merritt was waiting for him in the firm's 4th-floor conference room. She was 54, impeccably dressed, with the calm expression of someone who had spent 2 decades making difficult conversations feel like policy discussions. She gestured to the chair across from her without warmth. "Close the door," she said. Darius closed it and remained standing. "Sit down, Darius." He sat. Merritt folded her hands on the table. "The partners had a call this morning. We're concerned about the direction of your argument." "The direction of my argument," Darius repeated. "You're targeting the presiding judge directly. You're making accusations in open court that carry significant institutional risk for this firm." She paused. "Robert would not have taken this approach." "Robert found the same suppression order I did," Darius said. "He would have used it. Robert had 30 years of relationships in this building. You have 14 months. Her voice stayed level. "There is a version of this case where you argue the conviction on its merits, the suppressed testimony, the gaps in the timeline, and you win an exoneration for Marcus Reed without burning every bridge in the Michigan federal court system." Darius looked at her. "And a version where I don't mention that the judge who suppressed the evidence is the same man currently ruling against every argument I make." "A version," Merritt said carefully, "where this firm survives the aftermath." The room held that sentence for a moment. "Careers end here, not in headlines," she said finally. "Learn that early." She stood, straightened her jacket, and left without waiting for his response. Darius found Earl Grady's address in the original case file, a residential street in Dearborn Heights, the kind of neighborhood where the houses were small and well kept, and the residents had lived there long enough to know which neighbors to trust and which ones to avoid. He knocked at 4:15 in the afternoon. The man who answered was in his late 60s, thick through the shoulders with gray at his temples, and the guarded eyes of someone who spent years reading strangers at front doors. He had been Detroit PD for 27 years. He had been retired for 9. He looked at Darius the way men look at things they expected, but hoped wouldn't arrive. He started to close the door. Darius stopped it with one hand and asked the question that Calvin had suggested the night before, the question designed not to accuse but to open. "Did Holt hide the evidence from you too, Detective?" Grady went still. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The stillness itself, the way his grip on the door relaxed by a single degree, the way his eyes moved briefly to the street before returning to Darius, was the answer. Darius said quietly, "I'm not here to make trouble for you. I'm here because an innocent man has been inside Muskegon for 21 years, and the document that could have freed him was removed from your case file before trial." Grady stared at him for a long time. Then he stepped aside. They sat in Grady's kitchen. A television murmured in the next room. Grady wrapped both hands around a coffee mug and stared at the table. "I submitted Gloria Sims's statement the morning after she came in," he said. "Standard procedure. Logged it, filed it, included it in the case transfer to the DA's office. And then, 3 days later, Holt called me into his office. Said the statement was being excluded. Said the witness was unreliable, her account inconsistent, not worth the confusion it would create for the jury." Grady's jaw tightened. "I told him it wasn't his call to make unilaterally, that the defense had a right to know alternate suspects had been identified." "What did he say?" "He took the file out of my hands." Grady looked up. "Personally. Walked out of that office with it under his arm, and I never saw it again." Darius set his pen down. "Would you be willing to testify to that?" Grady laughed short, humorless. "Against Warren Holt." He shook his head slowly. "You understand what you're asking." "I understand exactly what I'm asking." Another long silence. Then Grady set down his mug. "There's someone else who was in that office the day Holt took the file. Another prosecutor. She saw the whole thing. Name, Sandra Vance. Retired. Lives out in Bloomfield Hills now." He paused. "She's been quiet about this for 21 years. Don't expect a warm welcome." He agreed to one sworn statement, nothing more. As Darius stood to leave, Grady spoke again quietly, without looking up from the table. "The people behind Holt aren't politicians, son. Politicians worry about elections." He finally met Darius's eyes. "These people worry about something else entirely." Darius held his gaze. "What do they worry about?" Grady's answer came in 2 words, delivered with the flat certainty of a man who had spent 27 years learning what the powerful truly feared. "Loose threads." Sandra Vance lived in a cream-colored colonial on a quiet street in Bloomfield Hills, where the lawns were professionally maintained and the neighbors didn't make eye contact at the mailbox. Darius pulled up at 9:20 in the morning and sat in his car for a moment, looking at the house. It was the kind of address that took decades to earn, the kind people protected. He knocked twice. The woman who answered was in her early 60s, silver-haired, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She was wearing a cardigan and holding a ceramic mug, and for exactly 1 second her face held the neutral expression of someone answering a door she expected to be a delivery. Then she saw Darius, and the mug stopped moving. "Miss Vance," he said. "My name is Darius Cole. I represent Marcus Reed." She tried to close the door. He didn't stop it with his hand this time. He stopped it with his voice. "Detective Grady told me you were in the room." The door paused, 3 inches open. Darius could see one of her eyes through the gap, and what he saw in it was not anger. It was fear, old and practiced and permanently installed, the kind that had been living in a person so long It had stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like wisdom. "I have nothing to say," she said. "I know about the suppression order," Darius said. "I know Holt removed Gloria Sims's statement personally. I know you watched it happen." Silence. "Miss Vance, Marcus Reed's daughter was 3 years old the last time she walked out of a visiting room holding her father's hand. She's 24 now. She has never once in her adult life had a normal conversation with her father outside of a prison." The door didn't open, but it didn't close either. "Please," Darius said. "Not strategically, just honestly." The door opened 3 more inches. Sandra Vance told her story in fragments, standing in her own hallway, never inviting him inside, never fully committing to the conversation, as though she was preserving the ability to deny it had taken place. Holt had not acted alone. She confirmed that immediately, in the same breath as her first sentence, as though it was the one thing she needed him to understand before anything else. There were people above him, she said. People who needed that conviction before the November election. Holt didn't decide to bury that statement. He was told to. Who told him? She shook her head. I was never given names. I was given instructions. There's a difference, and that difference is how people like me stayed out of the way for 21 years. What kind of instructions? That the case needed to close fast and clean. That any evidence creating reasonable doubt was a complication. That complications would be handled. She said the word handled with the specific flatness of someone quoting a phrase they had never been able to forget. Darius asked about Holt's insurance. Grady had mentioned it, the idea that a man like Holt wouldn't operate without protection. Sandra looked at him for a moment. Then she said, he kept records, everything. Names, dates, case numbers, arrangements. He called it his security. Where? She hesitated for a long time. Long enough that Darius thought she had decided to stop. Then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan, removed a pen, and wrote an address on the back of a grocery receipt she pulled from the same pocket. She held it out. He took it. Storage unit outside the city, she said. I drove him there once, 2 weeks after the Reed verdict. He went in alone. He was inside for 40 minutes. She paused. I never asked what he was storing. Darius folded the receipt. Will you testify? Her eyes filled not with sadness, but with something more complicated. Something that looked like the accumulated weight of 2 decades of a choice she had made and never fully made peace with. You think I don't know what I did, she said quietly. You think I haven't thought about that man every single day. Darius said nothing. I tried once, she said. 2 years after the trial. I wrote a letter to the state bar, anonymous. I dropped it in a mailbox on a Tuesday morning and went home and waited. She looked at him. Nothing happened. Not one thing. That's when I understood how deep it went. She stepped back and began to close the door, then stopped. They don't just threaten, she said. Her voice had dropped to just above a whisper. They finish. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand, Darius said. The door closed. He was home by noon. The door to his apartment was unlocked. Darius stopped in the hallway. He was certain he had locked it. He was always certain it was a habit his mother had drilled into him at 15 after a break-in on their block that had shaken the whole street. He pushed the door open slowly. The apartment had been taken apart. Drawers pulled out and emptied. Cabinet doors hanging open. The desk he used for casework had been swept clean, every folder, every printed document, every handwritten note gone. His backup hard drive gone. The printed copy of Gloria Sims's original statement gone. On the kitchen counter, a single sheet of white paper. Typed. No signature. Last warning. He stood in the wreckage of his own home and felt the tightening in his chest again. He let it sit there. He breathed through it. Then his phone buzzed. An email from Diane Merritt, time-stamped 11:58 a.m. Effective immediately, you are removed from active representation in Reed versus City of Detroit, pending internal review of professional conduct. This decision is final. Darius read it twice, set his phone face down on the counter. Then he called Calvin Webb and said 4 words. They just went personal. They left at 11:45 p.m. Calvin drove. Neither of them spoke much during the 40-minute ride out of the city, past the industrial corridors and the highway overpasses and the stretches of flat, dark land where Detroit's edges dissolved into something quieter and less watched. The address Sandra Vance had written on the grocery receipt led them to a storage facility on a frontage road outside Romulus, the kind of place built for forgetting rows of identical orange metal doors under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly in the cold. Unit 27 was in the 3rd row. Calvin cut the engine and looked at Darius. You understand that whatever is inside that unit changes everything. Everything already changed, Darius said. I just need proof. They got out of the car. The padlock was a standard combination model. Sandra had given Darius 4 digits on the back of the receipt, beneath the address written so small he almost missed them. The lock opened on the first try. The door rolled up with a sound like a held breath releasing. Inside floor-to-ceiling metal shelving banker's boxes stacked in labeled rows, 2 file cabinets against the far wall, a folding table in the center with a single lamp bolted to its frame. The lamp still worked. The extension cord ran to a power strip on the floor. Holt had not simply stored documents here. He had built a private archive. Calvin swept his flashlight slowly across the shelving. Each box bore a label in neat block letters, case names, docket numbers, dates, stretching back nearly 25 years. This isn't one case, Calvin said quietly. No, Darius said. It's not. He moved toward the folding table. In the center, arranged with almost deliberate neatness, sat a Pepperidge Farm cookie box, the classic red and gold farmhouse design, $4.99 price sticker still on the lid. Darius stared at it for a moment, with the specific bewilderment of a man who had expected many things and not this. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a rubber band, was a black leather notebook no larger than a hardcover novel. He opened it. The first page was a ledger. Columns of names, dates, dollar amounts, notations in Holt's precise handwriting. Judges. Prosecutors. Police commanders. City contractors. Political operatives. Beside each name, a case number. Beside each case number, a figure. Beside some figures, a single word confirmed. Darius turned pages, slowly scanning. Then he found the Reed entry. Conviction required before November election. Mayor's directive confirmed via Odom. Alternate witness statement removed October 14th. Grady objected contained. Vance compliant. Press event pre-scheduled. He stopped on the name. Odom. Calvin was reading over his shoulder. Deputy Mayor Carl Odom, he said softly. He was Holt's direct superior in the DA's office before moving to City Hall. Darius turned another page. More entries, more cases, more names. Then one name appeared twice in the margins, circled lightly in pencil, not a case name, a function. Beside it, a dollar figure and the words legal interference buffer with a retainer amount written neatly beneath. The name was Diane Merritt. Calvin went very still beside him. Darius closed the notebook. set it back in the Pepperidge Farm box, picked up the box. "We take everything, oh," Calvin said. They began pulling files, the read box first, then the financial correspondence folders, then the Odom communications. Calvin worked one side of the shelving, Darius the other. They had been inside 8 minutes when the headlights swept across the storage door. Both men froze. A car had entered the facility from the front gate. The headlights moved slowly, not a resident checking a unit, not a random arrival. Deliberate. Scanning. "Leave the boxes," Calvin said under his breath. "Take the notebook. Move." Darius tucked the cookie box under his arm and followed Calvin to the rear of the unit. There was a gap between the last shelf and the back wall, barely 18 inches, that opened to a service corridor running behind the row. Calvin had found it when they first entered. Darius had thought it was just dead space. It wasn't. They moved through it, single file, hunched the walls close enough to feel on both shoulders. Behind them, the storage unit door rattled. Voices. "Check everything." He said the files were here. They reached the end of the corridor, a fire door. Calvin hit the bar and pushed. Cold night air hit them like a wall. They ran. Darius heard the door behind them bang open as they cleared the corner of the building. A shout. Then a sound he had never heard in person before, sharp, flat, shockingly loud in the open air. A gunshot. Concrete chipped 6 inches to his left. He didn't stop. Calvin was already at the car key in the door. Darius threw himself into the passenger seat. The engine turned over. Another shot, this one wide high. Calvin floored the accelerator. The car behind them, a black SUV that had been parked near the facility entrance, surged to life in the rearview mirror. It followed them out onto the frontage road, closing fast. Calvin drove hard through 2 intersections, cut across an empty lot behind a warehouse complex, killed the headlights for 30 seconds, then brought them back up on a different road heading north. The SUV disappeared. He didn't slow down for another 10 minutes. When he finally pulled onto a side street and cut the engine, both men sat in the dark and said nothing. Darius still had the cookie box in his lap. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from the specific electricity of a man who has just seen confirmation of everything he suspected and survived the first attempt to stop him from using it. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. A voice. Flat, unhurried. The voice of someone who had done this before. "You have until sunrise." The line went dead. Darius lowered the phone slowly, looked at the notebook in the cookie box, looked at Calvin. Calvin stared straight ahead through the windshield at the dark street. "They know we have it," he said. "Yes," Darius said. "Then we don't sleep tonight." "No," Darius agreed. "We don't." They were inside Calvin's office by 2 a.m. with the door locked and the blinds drawn. By 4 a.m., they had organized everything from the storage unit into 3 working piles. Reads: specific evidence, financial ledger documentation, and the broader conspiracy materials connecting Holt to Odom Merritt and the mayor's office. By 6 a.m. Calvin had reached a federal contact in the Eastern District of Ohio, a senior investigator he had worked with 15 years earlier on a civil rights case involving municipal corruption in Columbus. Not Michigan. Not connected to Detroit's political infrastructure. That mattered. The meeting was arranged for the following morning in a borrowed conference room at a law school in Ann Arbor. Neutral ground. No announcement. No courthouse. Darius spent the intervening hours arranging Earl Grady's deposition. He secured a private office space downtown through one of Calvin's former colleagues, a retired family attorney who owed Calvin a favor and asked no questions. A court reporter was brought in independently, sworn to confidentiality, paid in cash. The deposition was scheduled for 10 a.m. No public record of the location. No notice filed with any court. Grady arrived at 10:22. He was sweating before he sat down. The deposition began cleanly. Grady stated his name, his rank, his years of service. He confirmed his role as lead investigator on the Marcus Reed case. He confirmed that Gloria Sims had come into the precinct voluntarily 3 days before trial and provided a detailed eyewitness account identifying an alternate suspect. "And what happened to that statement after you filed it?" Darius asked. "It was removed from the case file." "By whom?" Grady's hands tightened around the arms of his chair. He looked at the court reporter, then at the recorder on the table, then at Darius. "Under oath, Detective Grady." "Warren Holt," he said. "He took the file personally." "Did he provide a reason?" "He said the witness was unreliable." "Did you agree with that assessment?" "No." "Did you object?" "Yes." "What was his response?" Grady's voice dropped. "He told me if I wanted a future in the department, I would keep my mouth shut and let the case close." The court reporter's fingers moved steadily. The recorder light glowed red. Darius asked the final question. "To your knowledge, did the suppression of Gloria Sims's statement materially affect the conviction of Marcus Reed?" Grady looked at the table. A long silence. Then, yes. It ended 11 minutes later. Darius clicked off the recorder and turned to thank Grady. But Grady was already standing, reaching for his jacket, his eyes on the window that looked out over the building's rear parking structure. "Someone's been sitting in that lot for 40 minutes, he said. Darius moved to the window. One level down in the B2 parking structure, a dark sedan was idling near the stairwell entrance. It had been there when Darius arrived. He had noted it without thinking. He thought about it now. "It could be nothing," he said. "It's not nothing," Grady said. He was already moving toward the door. Darius followed him into the hallway and then to the elevator. "Grady, the deposition is complete. The statement is on record. You're protected." "I'm not protected," Grady said. "Protected is a word attorneys use." He hit the elevator button. "I'm a retired detective who just testified against a federal judge. Those aren't the same thing." The elevator opened. They rode down to B2 in silence. The doors opened to the parking structure. Grady stepped out, first keys in hand, moving toward his car in the far row. He made it 12 steps. Two men came from behind a concrete pillar, not running, walking the deliberate, unhurried approach of people who had decided what was going to happen before they arrived. They reached Grady in 4 strides. One of them shoved him hard into the side of a parked truck. Grady hit the door panel shoulder first and went down to one knee. Darius moved instantly. "Hey!" But the second man stepped directly into his path, close enough to be a wall, and looked at him without expression. The first man reached down and pulled Grady's bag from his shoulder, looked through it, removed Grady's phone, dropped the bag on the concrete. Then he leaned down and said loud enough for Darius to hear every word, "Next time it won't be a bag." They walked to the stairwell and were gone. Darius reached Grady in 3 steps and dropped to a knee beside him. A cut above Grady's eyebrow, bleeding steadily. His hands were shaking against the concrete floor. Grady looked up at Darius with an expression stripped of everything except the raw, unvarnished truth of a man who had spent 21 years telling himself he had made the only choice available to him. "Now do you understand?" he said. Darius helped him to his feet. "Yes," he said. "I understand." Grady recanted by 2 p.m. He called Darius from a number Darius didn't recognize and said in a voice that sounded like a man reading from a script he had written while shaking, I can't do this. If anyone asks, I have nothing to say about the Reed case. I never did. The line went dead. Calvin took the news without visible reaction. We still have the recording, he said. But without live testimony, a defense attorney attacks the circumstances of the deposition and the credibility collapses. Darius was already putting on his jacket. Where are you going? Calvin asked. Back to Bloomfield Hills. Calvin stood. Sandra Vance won't talk. You already tried. That was before they attacked Grady in front of me. Darius picked up his keys. She needs to understand that staying quiet isn't safety anymore. It's just a slower version of the same danger. He drove to Bloomfield Hills alone. He knocked on Sandra Vance's door for the second time in 3 days. When she opened it and saw his face, she said, "What happened?" They put Grady on the ground in a parking structure, Darius said. In front of me, in broad daylight. Sandra's hand tightened on the doorframe. They're not scared of exposure anymore, Darius said. They're cleaning up. And that means everyone who knows anything is already on a list. Sandra looked at him. The fear in her eyes was still there. But something else had entered it, something that had perhaps been waiting for a reason to surface for 21 years. There's a safety deposit box, she said quietly. Detroit Commerce Bank, downtown branch. She swallowed. Box 114. Then that same night, 10 blocks from his apartment, on a street he had driven 1,000 times, a black sedan appeared in Darius's rearview mirror and didn't disappear. He counted 4 turns. It matched all 4. Then its headlights surged forward. The first impact hit his rear bumper at speed. His car lurched. He fought the wheel. The second impact came before he had recovered from the first, harder, deliberate, the kind of force that communicates intent clearly. His car spun across the center line and struck a concrete barrier at the edge of an intersection. The airbag deployed. Glass somewhere. The world tipped sideways and then stopped. He sat in the wreckage for several seconds, hands still on the wheel, ears ringing. Calvin arrived 11 minutes after Darius's call. He pulled open the crumpled driver's door and stood there reading Darius's face in the red and blue light of the approaching sirens. Darius looked at him. Blood was running from above his left eye, warm and steady, dripping off his jaw onto the deflated airbag. He said it calmly. Without heat. With the specific, quiet certainty of a man who has just had something clarified for him beyond any remaining doubt. They just made the biggest mistake of their lives. By 6 the following morning, Darius Cole's face was on every major news outlet in Michigan. Not because he had won anything yet, because someone had tried to make sure he never would. The footage came from a traffic camera mounted at the intersection where his car had struck the barrier. It had captured the sedan accelerating into his rear bumper, twice deliberate, unmistakable. By midnight, the clip had been shared 40,000 times. By dawn, it had been picked up nationally. The headline that traveled furthest was simple and brutal. Attorney leading wrongful conviction case survives suspected hit and run. No arrests made. Calvin watched the coverage from his office with the sound low, and his phone pressed to his ear, working through a list of contacts he had been building for 30 years. Civil rights organizations, investigative journalists, federal attorneys from outside Michigan, whose names he trusted because he had watched them work under pressure and seen what they were made of. Public sympathy moved fast. Protest signs appeared outside the Detroit Federal Courthouse by noon, not organized, not coordinated, just people who had watched the footage and arrived with cardboard and markers because standing still felt impossible. By evening, the crowd had grown to several hundred. Political allies who had carefully avoided commenting on the Reed case began issuing statements, each one slightly more emphatic than the last, calibrated precisely to how quickly the wind was shifting. Calvin secured Box 114 at Detroit Commerce Bank using Sandra Vance's recorded authorization, submitted under emergency legal instrument, tied to an active civil proceeding. The branch manager read the paperwork twice, called his legal department, waited 14 minutes, and then personally escorted them to the vault. The box held 2 manila envelopes and a flash drive labeled in black marker, "Read Master File." They took everything to Calvin's office and spread it across the conference table. The first envelope contained private correspondence between Deputy Mayor Carl Odom and Warren Holt spanning 8 months prior to Marcus Reed's trial. 17 letters, some typed on city letterhead, some handwritten. The language was careful, bureaucratic, deliberately indirect. But the meaning was not ambiguous. One letter dated 6 weeks before trial read in part, "The mayor expects resolution before the November cycle. Complications at the evidentiary level will reflect poorly on everyone involved in case management. Handle accordingly." The second envelope held a financial ledger payment, records routed through 3 shell companies registered in Delaware disbursed to accounts belonging to 2 sitting judges, 4 police supervisors, a state appellate clerk, and 3 political operatives. Monthly transfers, consistent amounts, annotated with case numbers. Then Calvin opened the flash drive. The folder labeled "Read Master File" contained scanned documents and a chain of internal emails. Darius read through them in silence, page by page, his breathing steady, his face giving nothing away until he reached the final file. It was a press release, pre-drafted, dated 3 days before Marcus Reed's verdict was delivered, announcing the conviction as a victory for public safety, praising the work of the district attorney's office, and bearing in the upper right corner a handwritten notation in blue ink, "Approved." Run immediately after verdict. F.T. Franklin Tate, Mayor of Detroit. Darius set the page down carefully on the table, smoothed it flat with both hands, and looked at Calvin. Calvin looked back at him. He approved the press release before the jury came back. "Before the jury went in," Darius said. They delivered everything to the federal investigators from Ohio the following morning. 2 senior agents, 1 prosecutor, a sealed conference room at the University of Michigan Law School. Darius walked them through every document for 3.5 hours. When he finished, the lead investigator closed the final folder and said nothing for a moment. Then, "We'll need 48 hours to authenticate and coordinate." "Understood," Darius said. 48 hours passed. On the morning of the 3rd day, Calvin came into Darius's office carrying his phone screen first. Breaking news alerts stacked down the display. Darius read the top one. Federal probe into Judge Holt narrowed to individual misconduct. Mayor's office cleared of involvement. Deputy Mayor Odom denies allegations of coordination. Darius read it twice. Then he set Calvin's phone on the desk, stood up, and walked to the window. He stood there looking at the street below, without speaking for a long time. "Someone got to them," Calvin said. "Someone was already there," Darius said. The machine had not simply reacted to the federal referral. It had anticipated it. Someone inside the federal oversight structure had redirected the investigation before it could reach the mayor's office, narrowed its scope to Holt alone, and handed Tate a clean exit. Darius turned from the window. "Then we go to the people." Calvin didn't hesitate. "Yes." The interview was arranged within 6 hours. Diane Waverly was the most watched investigative journalist in Detroit, 15 years, at the city's dominant news network, a reputation for asking the question everyone else had decided not to ask. She had called Darius twice since the hit-and-run footage went public. He had not returned either call until now. They met at the studio at 7 p.m. Darius sat across from her under the lights, with the stitches still fresh above his left eye, and the Read Master file in a folder on the table between them. Waverly looked at him steadily. You understand what you're alleging publicly tonight. I understand exactly what I'm alleging, Darius said. The red light came on. Waverly introduced him, summarized the case in 4 sentences, then turned to him. Mr. Cole, the city has been told this investigation begins and ends with Judge Holt. Is that true? Darius looked into the camera. Not at Waverly. At the camera. At the people on the other side of it. No, he said. Judge Holt was not the head of this. He was the face of it. The men who built the machine he operated inside are still in their offices. One of them approved a press release announcing Marcus Reed's conviction before the jury delivered its verdict. The studio went absolutely silent. Waverly leaned forward. You have documentation of that. I have the press release, Darius said, with the mayor's handwritten approval, dated 3 days before the verdict. He held it up. The camera found it immediately. By the time the interview ended, Detroit was no longer a local story. And that night, Warren Holt called Darius's personal cell phone. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. The voice of a man who had decided that pretense was no longer worth the energy it cost. You have no idea, Holt said, who you just woke up. The money always told the truth. That was what Calvin said at 3 a.m. sitting across from Darius, with the financial ledger spread between them and a yellow legal pad filling up with notations. Politicians lied. Judges ruled selectively. Prosecutors shaped narratives. But money moved in one direction only toward the thing it was protecting, and if you followed it long enough without flinching, it led you to the person who had decided the protection was worth the price. They followed it for 6 hours. Shell company to shell company, Delaware, registration to Michigan, disbursement case number to payment date to political contribution record. The trail was not simple. It had been designed not to be. But it was there, and it was consistent. And at the end of it, at the root of every financial thread running through Holt's ledger, through Odom's correspondence, through the pre-drafted press releases and the suppressed witness statements and the 21 years of Marcus Reed's life, was a single name: Arthur Penn. Arthur Penn was 64 years old and did not appear in news coverage. He did not attend political events. He did not give interviews. He owned through a network of holding companies and investment vehicles controlling stakes in 14 private equity firms, 3 infrastructure development corporations, and buried 6 layers deep in the ownership structure, 5 private correctional facilities operating under state contracts across Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. His facilities required occupancy, state contracts paid by the bed. The business model was not complicated. More convictions meant more inmates. More inmates meant more contracts. More contracts meant more revenue. And revenue at the scale Arthur Penn operated justified the cost of ensuring the system that produced it kept running smoothly. Marcus Reed's conviction had not been a miscarriage of justice. It had been a transaction. Darius sat with that truth for a long moment. He thought of Marcus Reed's daughter, Aaliyah, 24 years old, who had grown up visiting her father through a sheet of reinforced glass. He thought of his own mother standing in the doorway, watching Andre's police car disappear. He thought of every family in every neighborhood like his who had been taught generation by generation to accept that the law was a system built by other people for other people's purposes. It wasn't indifference that had produced Marcus Reed's conviction. It was commerce. He financed the whole network, Darius said. For at least 15 years, Calvin confirmed, possibly longer. And if Reed is exonerated publicly, the entire model gets scrutiny, Calvin said. Every conviction tied to this network becomes questionable. Every contract becomes a liability. Darius filed the emergency expanded complaint at 4:17 p.m., a consolidated motion naming Mayor Franklin Tate, directly supported by the pre-drafted press release, the Odom correspondence, and the financial ledger connecting Penn's investment vehicles to political payments made during Reed's prosecution cycle. By 5 p.m., the filing had been received. By 6 p.m., 2 federal judges in separate jurisdictions had reviewed the attached documentation. By 7 p.m., the warrants were signed. Carl Odom was arrested outside his home in Grosse Pointe at 7:09 p.m. Still in his driveway, keys in hand. Diane Merritt was taken from her office on the 14th floor of the Brennan and Associates building at 7:23 p.m. Her assistant watched from the hallway and said nothing. Warren Holt was cornered in the parking structure beneath the federal courthouse annex at 7:41 p.m. He had apparently been attempting to reach his car with a travel bag. He did not resist. He simply stood beside his vehicle, with his hands at his sides, and waited for the agents to reach him with the expression of a man who had known for some time that this moment was possible. Mayor Franklin Tate was arrested at his downtown residence at 8:02 p.m. Every network in America carried the footage live. Darius and Calvin watched from Calvin's office, standing side by side in front of the television, neither of them speaking. Then, Holt's attorney called Calvin's office at 8:47 p.m. with a single message his client would speak to no one, except Darius Cole. The old federal annex on Griswold Street had been partially decommissioned 3 years earlier. Its hearing rooms emptied and repurposed for storage and administrative overflow. Holt had apparently made his way inside through a service entrance before the parking structure arrest team had moved to intercept him, and barricaded himself in hearing room C on the 3rd floor, the same room, according to building records, where he had argued his first major prosecution case 31 years earlier. Federal negotiators worked the situation for 22 minutes. Holt refused everyone. Then he sent one message through his attorney: he would surrender peacefully, without incident, to Darius Cole alone. Calvin argued against it for 4 minutes. Darius listened to every word. Then he put on his jacket and went. The hearing room was dark except for the emergency lighting. Holt stood near the judge's bench, not behind it, beside it, as though he understood that position was no longer available to him. He was in shirt sleeves, no tie, no robe. An old man in a room he had once ruled, standing in the ruins of everything he had spent his life constructing. He looked at Darius for a long moment without speaking. "Then you really are something, you know that." Darius stopped 10 feet away. "It's over, Judge." Holt smiled faintly. "You think this is over?" He looked around the empty room. "Men like Franklin Tate are temporary. Politicians come and go. But the infrastructure, the relationships, the arrangements, the architecture—" He touched the bench lightly with 2 fingers. "Men like me build that. And it doesn't disappear because one case unravels. Men like you," Darius said, "built it on top of people who couldn't fight back." His voice was even, not angry, just clear. Marcus Reed's daughter spent her entire adult life visiting her father through glass, so Arthur Penn's facilities could hit their occupancy numbers. You didn't build infrastructure. You built a machine that ran on other people's lives. Holt's jaw tightened. For one moment the mask came down completely, and what sat beneath it was not defiance. It was the hollow defensive fury of a man who had always known somewhere beneath the language and the justifications exactly what he was. "Men like you," Holt said quietly, "were never supposed to reach this room." Darius looked at him without expression. "And yet," he said. "Here I am." Holt held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he reached slowly into his breast pocket and removed a folded envelope. He set it on the counsel table between them and slid it forward. "For when you understand what it costs," he said, "to pull on the thread all the way to the end." Federal agents moved through the doorway before Darius could respond. They crossed the room efficiently, turned Holt toward the wall, and secured his hands behind his back. He offered no resistance. He kept his eyes on Darius as they moved him toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back one final time. "The name at the bottom of that list," he said, "is the man who financed everything, including me." Then he was gone. Darius opened the envelope. Inside, a single page dense with names: judges, prosecutors, city officials, state legislators, federal appointees. At the very bottom of the page, one name, circled in red ink: Arthur Penn. He walked out of the hearing room and found Calvin waiting in the hallway. He handed him the page without a word. Calvin read to the bottom. His hand slowed. He looked up at Darius with an expression Darius had never seen on him before in the entire time he had known him. Not surprise, not anger, fear. "Do you know who this is?" Calvin said. "Tell me," Darius said. Calvin looked back at the circled name. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something just above a whisper. "He's the man," Calvin said, "who paid for all of them." Penn Tower rose 43 stories above downtown Detroit, all glass and clean lines, the kind of building that communicated permanence so confidently it had stopped needing to try. Darius rode the elevator to the top floor at 9 p.m. with the envelope in his jacket pocket, and Calvin's voice in his earpiece saying for the fourth time that this was a mistake. "I know," Darius said. "He'll have lawyers in that room before you finish your first sentence." "I know." "Then why?" "Because I want to look at him." The elevator opened to a reception area of dark wood and low light. A woman in a gray suit was waiting. She led Darius down a corridor to a corner office that occupied the entire northeast face of the building. Floor-to-ceiling glass. The whole city below. Arthur Penn was standing at the window with his back to the door. He turned when Darius entered. 64 years old, silver-haired, unhurried. The kind of man who had been the most powerful person in every room he had ever entered for so long that power had stopped feeling like a condition and had become simply the texture of his existence. He looked at Darius with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I've been following your work." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Darius did not sit. Penn sat. He opened a leather folder on his desk and turned it to face Darius. Inside, a partnership stake offer from one of Penn's primary investment vehicles. A board appointment, a speaking contract. Numbers that together represented more money than Darius's mother had earned in her entire working life, multiplied several times over. "You're extraordinary," Penn said simply, genuinely. "What you've done this week, the tenacity, the precision, that's rare. I don't say that to flatter you. I say it because I recognize it, and I don't ignore things I recognize." Darius looked at the folder, then at Penn. "You financed Marcus Reed's conviction," he said. Penn's expression didn't change. "I finance systems. Other men make operational decisions within those systems. There's a meaningful legal distinction." "There are 23 other men still inside Michigan correctional facilities whose cases are flagged in Holt's ledger," Darius said. "Your facilities, your contracts. Unproven allegations tied to a disgraced judge's private notes," Penn said. "Courts will take years to untangle that if they ever do." He tapped the folder. "You could spend those years fighting a machine you cannot dismantle from the outside. Or you could build something real with real resources from a position of actual influence." Darius looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "No." Penn closed the folder without visible reaction. He opened a different one. Inside were photographs. Darius's mother, Yvonne, leaving morning service at Greater Grace Temple on Sunday. Calvin Webb entering his office building on East Jefferson. Marcus Reed in the Muskegon prison yard seated on a bench, unaware of the camera. Aaliyah Reed walking to her car in a parking lot. I want to be clear. Penn said, his voice carrying the same unhurried calm as before, that this is not a threat. I don't make threats. This is simply an education in consequences. The world you are attempting to dismantle has been in place for a very long time. It has resources, relationships, and patience that extend well beyond any single case or any single attorney. He looked at Darius steadily. Walk away with the victory you've earned. Reed will go free. Holt will face accountability. That is a genuine achievement. Take it. Darius reached across the desk. He picked up the surveillance folder, held it. You just gave me the final charge, he said. For the first time, something shifted in Penn's face. Not fear exactly. The first faint arrival of the recognition that he had miscalculated. Darius walked out. Arthur Penn was arrested at Penn Tower at 11:14 a.m. the following morning on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. His attorneys filed motions within the hour. The motions were denied. The footage of his arrest, taken by a news crew that had received an anonymous tip about the timing, ran on every major network before noon. Marcus Reed's exoneration hearing lasted 11 minutes. The replacement judge reviewed the suppression order, Gloria Sims's original statement, the documented chain of concealment, and Holt's signed admission of conflict. He looked at the paperwork for a long time. Then he looked at Marcus Reed, seated at the plaintiff's table in a borrowed suit, 64 years old, with 21 years behind him that would never come back. The judge said, Mr. Reed, on behalf of this court, I am deeply sorry. Marcus Reed nodded once. His hands were flat on the table. His jaw was working. He did not speak. His daughter Aaliyah, seated directly behind him, reached forward and placed both hands on his shoulders. She pressed her forehead against the back of his head and stayed there completely still while the courtroom sat in respectful silence around them. Darius watched from the plaintiff's chair and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. 31 additional convictions were flagged for review over the following 3 months. Special prosecutors were appointed. Review boards convened. Families who had spent years believing no one was coming were told that someone was finally looking. Darius declined every offer that arrived in the weeks after Penn's arrest. Partnership tracks at 4 elite firms, a national speaking agency, a cable news contributor contract, a book deal proposed by a publisher in New York whose editor called twice. He declined all of them on the same day in the same email in 2 sentences. Instead, on a Tuesday morning in October, he stood on the sidewalk on Mack Avenue in East Side Detroit, while a sign was mounted above the door of a renovated brick building that had previously been a check-cashing store. Cole and Webb Justice Center. His mother cut the ribbon. She was wearing her good coat, and she was crying before the scissors touched the ribbon, and she didn't try to stop herself. Calvin stood at the edge of the gathered crowd with his arms folded and his eyes wet and his face arranged in the expression of a man pretending very hard not to be moved. Marcus Reed was there. He stood near the back beside Aaliyah, watching with the quiet attention of someone who understands the weight of a moment, because they have paid for it in a currency most people will never be asked to spend. That evening, after the crowd had gone and the office was quiet, Darius and Calvin stood outside on the sidewalk. The October air was cold and clean. Down the street, children were playing under a working streetlight. Calvin looked at the sign above the door. He tore your motion in half, he said, in front of everyone. First morning. Darius looked at the sign too. Best thing he ever did for me, he said. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then, you know what you actually did, don't you? Not just Reed, not just Holt. Darius waited. You proved, Calvin said, that the machine is only invincible until someone decides it isn't. Darius didn't answer. He looked down the street at the children under the light at the neighborhood his mother had raised him to see clearly and love anyway, at the city that had failed so many people for so long and was only now slowly, imperfectly beginning to reckon with the cost of that failure. He thought of Marcus Reed's daughter pressing her forehead to her father's back in a quiet courtroom. He thought of his mother in her good coat crying before the scissors touched the ribbon. He thought of Andre walking home thinner and quieter and permanently careful about where he walked after dark. Then he thought of Warren Holt standing in that empty hearing room in his shirt sleeves beside a bench that no longer belonged to him, saying the words that had perhaps without intending to told the truest thing Holt had ever said in a courtroom. Men like you were never supposed to reach this room. Darius looked at the sign one last time. Then he went inside to meet his first client. Life lesson. Justice does not maintain itself. It requires people willing to pay the cost of it, people who show up anyway when powerful men laugh, who keep walking when the door is slammed, who understand that silence has never once protected anyone it was supposed to protect. Darius Cole did not win because the system worked. He won because he refused to let the system be the final word. Wherever you are watching from tonight, remember this. The machine is only untouchable until someone decides to touch it. If this story moved something in you, drop your city and the time where you are in the comments. Someone near you may be carrying a fight just like this one right now. And if you believe truth is worth fighting for, subscribe. The next story is already waiting.